Hello and welcome to Lecture 3. I almost feel like I'm in a Clint Eastwood movie and the cats are looking at me saying, "Do you feel lucky? Do you, punk?" Let's see if we can get through this one with a little less cat flagellation. Or not. Maybe you guys find that entertaining. But let's go on, and one thing that we're going to pick up on here is the next three portions of Homework 2. So remember that Homework 2 spanned both Lecture 2 and 3. So this will help you guys sort out who's going to do what within the assignment. And remember, each person's going to take a chunk, and then you all assemble it together and submit it as one assignment. So we're going to talk about the Enlightenment philosophy of emotions. So we're moving out of the Dark Ages. We're back kind of in Western thinkers and this period of time called the Enlightenment. So it's gradual in the dawn of enlightenment, this transition, and the move away from metaphysical explanations doesn't occur overnight. So empiricism is going to be introduced here, and we're going to move towards it, but it is a slow transition, right? Rationalism, empiricism take center stage, though, as they commence their struggle with old-school metaphysics. Now, Bacon, an empiricist, stresses sense perception and inductive reasoning. Certainty is replaced in large part by acknowledgement of probabilistic explanations. And to me, this is kind of one of the core elements of critical thinking, right, is that we now begin to think that multiple outcomes are possible, and what we need to do then is list those outcomes and determine a probability for each, right? So as a critical thinker, we engage in this, and in some of my classes I actually ask students to do this. So rationalist advocates, Spinoza and Descartes, believe explanations deductively generated can lead to certainty. So we have either the top-down or the bottom-up processes that are going to be introduced. Inductive reasoning then proceeds from observations to broad generalizations. So it's data-driven. It begins with an observation. It's more open-ended, and it's more bottom-up. So we see something in the world, and then we might see it again, and we see it again over time, and it translates to a hypothesis, and then from that we develop a theory with the idea that the theory can explain many observable phenomena. So this is bottom-up reasoning, and this is a great way to start a research program, right? That we take real-world observations and we say, why did that occur? And from those real-world observations, develop a theory. Now, deductive reasoning goes the opposite direction, right? It proceeds from general to more specific, so it's theory-driven. So we have a theory, and from that theory, then, we can make testable hypotheses, so it's more narrow in its focus. And what we're really trying to do then is confirmation, hypothesis confirmation. So check it out, because when you use both, then you really kind of round out your whole scientific endeavor. They support each other. Inductive, as example, a child's observed crying when not given a toy. Crying is a result of the children's needs being frustrated. Okay, so I see, oh, the child is crying because it didn't get a toy. Look, oh, they didn't get a toy and the child's crying again. Oh, look, the child didn't get the second dessert, so it's crying. And I establish a pattern. The child seems to cry when it's subjected to these stimuli, right? And then I develop a theory that says, well, it must be that the child's wants are being frustrated, and that's the cause of crying. And now I can be really mean to the kid, because what I can do now is intentionally deprive the child, right, to see if the child cries. So notice I've gone from bottom to top and then top back down again, and that's the beauty of science, and that's science well done. Combines both of those components. Let's try a deductive example here, a different example. Fear is an avoidant emotion. Determine if participants step backwards when presented a fear-evoking stimulus. So if I bring people into the lab and I give them the opportunity to step forward or back, which do they choose when they're exposed to fear-evoking stimuli? Right? More on that when we get to the research idea. So let us then talk about the rationalist, Descartes and Spinoza. Descartes and his little gland. Well, Cartesian dualism, that is, kind of kind of the given, right? That he was a dualistic philosopher, and the idea was that mind and body are separate, and that's how he got to it. So the body is material and physical, the mind is spiritual and metaphysical. So he makes a clear dividing line. There's no need to define the soul as Aristotle had done, because the soul can be a thinking entity. It can think, it can feel, that it has all of those. The soul is conscious, and it's not mechanical or bodily functions, which would be then the physical or material aspect. Passions are tied to the body, generated there to disturb the soul. So a clear example like this is if Penelope were to bite me, which she's not going to do now because I asked her to, but that's going to cause pain, right? And that's something that I feel physically, and that's going to perturb the soul, and the soul's going to think about, well, why am I feeling this pain? Maybe I shouldn't stick my finger into the cat's mouth, right? And I learned through that manner the combination of the two. Now, the pineal gland, this all-important gland, which it's amazing that he had a name for it, and you know, because this is a deep brain mechanism. The pineal gland transfers perceptions of the body to be processed by the soul. And no, it maybe isn't so much like that, but the pineal gland, right? And so it's an endocrine gland. It's located in the center of the brain between the two hemispheres. Tiny little thing, 5 to 8 millimeters. It's got a pine cone shape. It's involved in the wake-sleep cycle, but to many folks back in the day, they believed that it was the seat of the soul. So if you ask, where's the soul? Well, it's in the pineal gland right there, right? And it's this little, but now, and let's give props to Jung for a minute, because Jung talked about the collective unconscious, especially expressed through art. And look at all these different societies and all their different images. Pinecone, 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 with staff, right? Pinecone. So we can be in ancient Egypt, we can be in Greece, we can be in the Middle East. It really doesn't matter. The pinecone has this tremendous level of importance. Isn't that fascinating? Or not, all right? So passions, at least some, can be inherited during pregnancy from one's mother, such as food preferences. Wow, interesting idea, right? One's experience of passion is dependent on the physical nature of one's brain, right? And that is the actual construction of the brain, and the balance of the humors. So our current state might have an effect on our response to stimuli at a neural level, according to Descartes. And that's some pretty sophisticated thinking when you think about the evidence that was lacking in making these conclusions. And these components interact with one's experience. A traumatic childhood experience that causes fear creates an association between a stimulus object and a passion that's represented in a change of biochemistry. So if I am bitten by a dog and I can acquire fear, a passion, right, a fear of dogs, then this passion can arise upon exposure to that stimuli. And this really can be thought as a precursor of Pavlovian or classical conditioning. So we see that even back then, with a lack of experimental methods surrounding a lot of these ideas, the theories become pretty well supported in time. So Descartes talks about intellectual emotion, and this is a lead into the number 4 section of homework 2. Knowledge originating in the body is unreliable. It occurs, but these passions should be minimized as information. Now, I love this term, but in a modern vocabulary, it's affect as information. And Gerald Clore was one of the first guys to talk about this idea, that affect comes to us as information. But notice, when we say affect as information, we're saying our affective state, or the passions, as Descartes said, can be used as information, but their use should probably be minimized and supplanted to a great deal by reason. Right? So knowledge originating in the mind represents reason, but passion is of the body, the mind is part of the soul, so now we have this dualistic kind of mechanism that Descartes is describing. So knowledge originating in the mind represents reason, and this is the source of intellectual emotion. So we have these kind of coarse passions, and remember that term coarse from the Greeks, right? But then we have the ability to intellectualize and create higher level emotions, if you will. Intellectual emotion has no bodily expression. Intellectual emotion can give rise to certain passions such as wonder, curiosity, or joy. So it is a bi-directional process, right? It doesn't work in just one direction. Intellectual emotion has the potential to be cultivated, it appears, through mind and experience. So can we do emotion training? Can we become more emotionally intelligent? Well, if we were to sit down with Descartes and ask these questions, he would say, sure. He'd probably also say, I think, therefore I am, but that would be another story. Note how close this resembles Aristotle's division of the soul, sensitive versus intellectual. So we make progress, but often we start with kind of the same base idea and just make it more nuanced or complex. Right? So let's take homework 2 then, number 4, Descartes' dualism, right? Intellectual emotion as opposed to passion. And this is going to take some thinking and it's going to take some imagination. So if you want to make this selection, keep those in mind. Give an example of a passion and give an example of an intellectual emotion. So something that arises from the body and something that arises from the soul. Right? The former, of course, originates in the body. What does it feel like? So let's get to the kind of the sensory experience in this regard. What was the instigating stimuli? And I always want you to, so when you're telling your story, encounter the stimuli and how it automatically causes this passion to arise from the body. You are telling a story of sorts in this assignment. For the intellectual emotion example, how did it arise? It was in response to what? Okay? So this is going to be a higher level, more complex emotion that requires thought rather than merely the body encountering a stimulus. So I want you to work those out and tell a story about each, right? Then let me know why you're classifying your choice as an intellectual emotion. So that's one thing that I look for in this class is there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer, but you can indicate to me how you got to it, what the thinking process was involved. Because that's what I'm interested in, is how did you think this out, right? Not really the ultimate answer, but what was the thinking involved in it, right? So if you have any questions, what are you going to do? That's right. You're going to come to office hours. You're going to come to our Zoom meeting, whatever you need to do. And if you come to the Zoom meeting and you ask questions about this, it's really awesome and it's really contributory, if that's a word, right? Because there'll be other people at the Zoom meeting, I hope, right, that hear your question and probably benefit from the answer. And remember, we record those Zoom sessions for our fellow Buckeyes that can't get there based on whatever life circumstances they have, right? And they can benefit watching it asynchronously, watching the recorded Zoom session. So, on to Spinoza and the general approach to affect. Spinoza was heavily influenced by Descartes, and these guys studied each other. The ethics dealt with God, mind, body, emotion, and ethics. It represented the Cartesian dualism, but it takes a different approach, and that's why, you know, it's no good simply to repeat what someone before you said. You got to put your own spin on it, right? You've got to extend it. Now, for Spinoza, there's 3 basic affects, and he's been very detailed, and he's going to not be so loosey-goosey in his theorizing, and a lot more specific, and probably a breath of fresh air for many of us coming out of these first 3 lectures, right? So, the 3 basic affects are desire, joy, and sadness. Now, the deal is, how do they occur? What stimulates them? What's the difference? And Spinoza is very specific. So, desire is the most basic and general of the affects. It's the conatus, the general tendency to prolong or survive. And what this means is, it's intimately tied to the concept of power, which is key to survival. To the extent that I have power to acquire food, acquire a mate, acquire shelter, acquire water, all the things that are necessary to existence at a most basic level, right? These are expressions of power, that power allows me to do this. Now, it can become more sophisticated in time. That is, I can seek political office or run an organization, amass a shit ton of money or whatever, right? But power is associated with these. So then desire is the basic affect for the acquisition of power, right? And then joy demonstrates the result of acquiring power. Sadness, on the other hand, is simply defined as a decrease in one's power. So power for Spinoza is akin to potential, and remember potential because we've already discussed that, but But the greater the power, the greater the potential, right? My ability to produce an activity and to satisfy my needs. Right? Questions about that? Think about that. That's pretty spiffy, and it's pretty simple, and it's pretty on point. Now, let's take then Spinoza and blended emotions. That is affects versus passions. Emotions such as anger and fear are considered the result of different combinations of the three basic emotions. That is desire, joy, and sadness, right? So to the extent that I desire power and I'm successful in achieving power, right, then I'm probably going to experience joy. So that's a combination. But what happens if there's a threat to my power? What if someone is trying to take my power? Then I might actually become angry at that person, right? Or I might be anticipating in the future movements against my power, and the need to protect my power is represented by fear. So at least for Spinoza, we have really the three basics: desire, joy, and sadness, but those can generate fear and anger as more complex kind of combinations or recombinations. Now, this is according to Spinoza. I would differ greatly on this from Spinoza, but we're telling Spinoza's story right now. One thing I want you to remember in this class all throughout, though, is you're going to develop your own theory of emotion based on a thorough reading, understanding of all the extant theories. So, affects represent body's capacity to act, while passions are thought of as passive affects. And we get back to this active-passive kind of idea, which I don't think gains a lot of traction throughout, but we'll discuss regardless. Affects are tied more to the ability to exert power, to control, and that would be active, my ability to exert power. Passions are tied to the loss of power, represented by sadness. So I think Spinoza gives us one of the clearest and simplest definitions of passive versus active. Active would be the attempted acquisition of power, and passive is somewhat the loss of power. So, Spinoza then, for individuality, because both mind and body can be thought of as active, Cartesian dualism is largely moved beyond for Spinoza. The dualism becomes less and less important. Ethics, and that's true of science in this day and age, that we're beginning to merge mind and body into a more cohesive, complex view of how we operate. Ethics, then, is the idea that affects are dependent on the relationship between one and external objects. And we can see how ethics arise from that, because do we come by things honestly, or do we come by things inappropriately in our desire and acquiring power, right? So the idea of ethics is to put the constraints on our behavior to a certain extent. So based on a given time and situation, give context to memory of events, and this is very Proustian indeed, that when Marcel Proust talked about remembrances of things past, this shapes our relationship to power facilitation or power loss. Right? So let's take a quote from Spinoza. Fame is also a great drawback. If we must pursue it, we must direct our lives so as to please the fancy of men. And isn't that the crazy thing about fame? Because we may seek fame as it relates to power, but the acquisition of fame almost enslaves us to the opinion of others. And no doubt Spinoza is a deep thinker, right? So the role of perception in one's power, affects then and passions depend on activity and passivity that reflect the acquisition or the loss of power. Our relationship with people and situations are at the heart of experience of sensation. And notice that the power dynamic really is kind of an interpersonal dynamic. That is power over others, or others' power over us, right? Our preferences for certain people and certain situations can be explained within terms of power afforded to us within these contexts. So we might have decided preferences. But individual differences might dictate that I take a generally passive approach to life and prefer people who have power, right? Who will make decisions, who will call the shots and perhaps direct me. Many people are inherently passive, if you want to go that route, or have learned to be habitually passive, so they like to be directed. Now, where else but but the internet can we find, right, philosophical powers, and we can find the Baruch Spinoza, right, with psychophysical parallelism action. Gotta love the internet. When I look for images of Spinoza that I put in the lecture, I found this and I couldn't resist. So, and it's silliness. Let's talk about, look, we're already up to number 5. We're getting there. Element of homework number 2. And this one, Spinoza. So if you're interested in this, hop on it, right? Let us consider Spinoza's 3 affects, describe an instigating situation scenario for each as it relates to perceived power. Okay? So really tell a story for each one and its relationship to power. Then consider one of the blends, either anger or fear, take your pick, right? And what is the process of combination of the affects? And I alluded to that, I gave you a very brief example. You can flesh that out to a greater extent, from which either anger or fear arose. Again, describe this in terms of a scenario so that you make it real for your reader. Okay? And I'm going to break here, and we're going to come back to the empiricists as we do part 2 of lecture 3.